Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar today, where we present the Fairwork Foundation, an action research project here at the OII. Our speakers today are Dr. Funda Ustek-Spilda and Srujana Katta. A little housekeeping: we are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. There'll be time for a Q&A session at the end, so please do pose any question using the Q&A tab at any time, and try and keep questions as concise as possible. The questions will be visible to all attendees and they can be upvoted. We will endeavour to answer any unanswered queries in follow-up. Please allow me to introduce Funda and Srujana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the webinar.
Hi, everyone.
It's really great to have all of you watching. My name is Srujana Katta. I work at the Fairwork Research Project, as Isabel just said, and that's what I'll be talking to you about today. And maybe Funda, you want to jump in?
Sure, and hi, everybody. I'm Funda. I work with Srujana on the Fairwork Project as a postdoctoral researcher.
Great. So I guess our talk today is divided into two parts. I'll tell you a little bit about the project first, and then Funda will come in later and tell you about some of our ongoing work into COVID-19 pandemic and gig work. So let me share my screen. All right. Great. So I will be talking a little bit about the Fairwork Project and what we do. We've been researching working conditions in the global gig economy over the past several years. And to quickly summarize our approach, which I'll talk through in some detail, what we do is we research working conditions at digital labor platforms like Uber, Helpling, and Deliveroo. And then through our research, we develop fairness ratings or scores for those platforms. And then we take those scores and we use them as a lever to improve pay and conditions for platform workers. And in that way, our ultimate aim is to try and improve working conditions at these platforms. So let me explain in some detail how we exactly go about doing that. So when I say the gig economy, or also the platform economy, what I'm talking about is economic transactions that are happening through, via, and on digital platforms. So among those economic transactions, we can also distinguish between digital platforms where people sell commodities, like Airbnb, where you rent flats, or eBay, and where people sell their labor. So examples of the second kind of digital labor platform include Uber and Deliveroo, and those are the kinds of platforms that the Fairwork Project focuses on. And even among digital labor platforms, there are broadly two types. There's cloud work platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk and Upwork, where in theory, the work can be technically done from anywhere around the world via the internet. And the second type are geographically tethered platforms, sometimes called location-based platforms like Uber, Deliveroo, Helpling, and so on, where the work has to be done in a specific location. Sorry. So the thing about the gig economy is really big and it's growing, but no one really knows how big exactly it is. The most recent estimate in the UK is that there are around 3 million workers, 3 million adults in the UK who work in the gig economy. If we look at the whole world, this figure is vastly magnified, and estimates range between a few tens of millions of people to more than 200 million people. In the global south, one of our Fairwork research colleagues, Richard Heeks, based at the University of Manchester, recently estimated that there's around 90 million people, there's around 90 million people in the global south who work in the gig economy. And moreover, the scale of such gig-based labor transactions is rapidly expanding, and it's predicted that by 2025, 1/3 of all labor transactions may happen via digital platforms. So the way that this model works is that instead of a traditional employment relationship, the platform presents itself as a simple intermediary between the consumer and the worker, not employing the worker and treating the worker essentially as an independent business. And in some cases, this classification of workers as independent contractors or self-employed workers is genuine, but in others, there's a case of misclassification. Irrespective of whether the classification is legitimate or not, the point is that workers who work in the gig economy are often not protected by some of the employment rights that they would have had they been classified as employees. So my colleagues at Fairwork have been researching the gig economy in different contexts across Africa, Asia, and Europe over the past decade. And we've collectively interviewed over 400 platform workers in many countries, including Vietnam, the Philippines, India, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, and most recently in Germany and the UK as well. Through this research, what we found is that, of course, there are a lot of benefits that accrue to platform workers. Most obviously, they have a job and an income that they may not have had otherwise, but also a lot of platform workers really value the flexibility that the gig economy affords them, and feel that the way that they are managed via digital platforms is more objective than in a relationship where they're managed by humans. Whether that's true or not, difficult to say. But we've also encountered a range of issues. Lots of workers fall through the cracks, and when they do, because they aren't employees and because they're rarely protected by local labor regulations, they do suffer. So some of these problems that gig workers face are gig work by definition, because of the gig nature of it, is precarious and insecure. It's often unsafe. And in most cases, there's an oversupply of labor power, which leads to vulnerability. Often there is low pay. In some contexts, take-home pay after taking into account costs that workers have to face can fall below local minimum wages. Some workers also experience explicit discrimination. Some experience wage theft. There's a lack of accountability for digital platforms, which often tend to be located across international borders, and workers do not have due recourse in any decisions that are made. And workers can, for instance, be fired or deactivated from the platform sometimes without any due process. And ultimately, there's an inability or many blocks to collectively organizing or bargaining in the gig economy. Many of these issues have been coming to a head. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the headlines in recent years in many contexts, and we've seen a lot of strikes and protests by gig workers around the world. Just put some headlines of such strikes. So these are basically the starting conditions that led to the foundation of the Fairwork Project. The point of the project is to sidestep the discussion about employment status and acknowledge that irrespective of how the worker is classified in their context, platform companies do have some control over the conditions of their workers. And if they have that control over working conditions, then we can encourage those platforms to improve those working conditions. So what we basically set out to do are 4 things. First, we wanted to co-develop a set of fair work principles with the people and organizations that they impact on, the workers and the platforms. Second, we wanted to carry out research to evaluate the digital labor platforms against those principles and use that. And then third, use that research, like I said, to give each of these major platforms a fairness rating or a fair work score out of 10. And the plan was to start assessing geographically tethered platforms and then to expand to cloud work platforms, which we've done this year. Then we wanted to use these scores that we developed as a pressure point to encourage fairer work and discourage unfair work. Ultimately, the aim of the project is to understand and counter some of the forces that disempower gig workers across the world. So we started our project in 2018. We piloted all of this in India and South Africa in 2019. This year, we've additionally started pilots in Germany, the UK, Indonesia, Chile, and Ecuador. And alongside this year, also alongside rating geographically tethered platforms like Uber, we've also started researching working conditions at cloud work or platforms or online work platforms, to produce a pilot set of global cloud work scores. And for next year, we've partnered with researchers in Bangladesh, Brazil, Egypt, Hong Kong, and Pakistan to produce Fairwork scores there as well. So our first task, essentially, when we started out, was to determine what we meant by fair work. We wanted to ensure that the principles that we are using emerged from a genuine process of dialogue with key stakeholders. So we took a summary of existing labor standards outside the gig economy to some meetings that we co-organized with the International Labour Organization and UNCTAD in Geneva. This was the first meeting that my colleagues had back in 2018, where they brought together workers, platforms, unions, and academics to talk about ways of setting fairness standards in the gig economy. And out of these meetings came a list of 5 fair work principles for the platform economy. These are our principles. That's a lot of text. It's all on our website for anybody who wants to explore this in some detail. But to quickly go over it, we have 5 principles, the first of which is fair pay. So this basically means that people should be paid a decent wage in their jurisdiction. The second principle is fair conditions, which is to say that workers' health and well-being needs to be protected by the platform. The third is fair contracts, which means that at a minimum, platforms need to be following the national law where the workers are based and have a clear contract. And also, they should not be imposing any unfair contract terms on the workers. Then there's fair management, where this means that there needs to be an appeals process in place where workers can appeal decisions, and policies to ensure that there's equality in the way that different groups of workers are managed. And finally, fair representation. This means that we want there to be a process in place where worker voice can be expressed to the platforms, and where platforms recognize collective bodies like unions where they exist and engage with them. So our website, like I said, contains the details for these principles. Do go and explore if you have some time. I've only basically described the spirit of each principle, but they break down into quite specific criteria that platforms need to meet in order to be awarded the relevant points. And so these are the 5 universal principles, but they break down into 2 separate sets. One that are for geographically tethered platforms, and a separate set for cloud work platforms or online platforms, because workers tend to face quite different circumstances depending on which platform they work for. And our principles are not set in stone. We gradually evolve them on a year-on-year basis as worker circumstances evolve and as we learn more through our research and in dialogue with workers, unions, platforms, and other stakeholders. This graphic here basically depicts how our annual principle change process works. So we have this sort of iterative process of dialogue, and then through that we co-develop and continuously evolve the 5 core principles that we think universally should apply to all platform work. So then, now that we have these principles, we work to develop ways of assessing platforms against them in order to give each platform a fair work score out of 10 points. What you see here is basically the scoring system. In each of our pilot countries, what we do is we work with local researchers, workers, and others to work out the locally applicable thresholds that would translate the universal principles into the context in a way that makes sense. For example, when we say a decent wage, that needs to break down into locally specific minimum wages that often differ across sectors and locations. So local researchers work to try and find out how exactly what fair pay looks like in that context. Our detailed methodology is also available on our website if you're interested in knowing more. And so for each of the 5 principles, platforms can get a basic point and then an advanced point if they first achieve the basic point of that principle. So that means that across the principles, platforms can potentially be awarded a total of 10 points. So with these principles and the scoring system, we moved on to the second objective, which is to research work conditions at platforms. The methods that we use, we triangulate data from a variety of methods. First, we interview workers in the case of cloud work platforms, we survey workers online, and then we interview some of them. And second method we use is desk research to look at publicly available information and documentation. And finally, we also interview platform management at each of the platforms that we assess. And in order to allow ourselves the ability to score platforms that don't want to participate in our process, we decided that we are only going to stand behind the evidence of positive points rather than negative points. So that means that if we don't have any evidence that a platform meets a certain threshold, then they don't get that point. It doesn't mean that they don't in practice follow and meet that principle, but we just don't have the evidence to give them that point. So for each of the country where we produce scores, we enlist the help of some colleagues from our other project countries. And this way it enables a sort of peer review of the scores and helps to ensure that there's some uniformity in how we apply our principles across all the contexts. So then by collecting data in this way about all large platforms operating in our project countries, we are able to assign every one of those platforms a score and a scorecard. What you see here is an example of the scorecard for Clever Shuttle, which is a transportation company in Germany. This is from our most recent Germany report, which is available on our website, as is everything else. And you'll see that Clever Shuttle scored 9 out of 10, and they got all the points except 4.2, which is the advanced point under fair management. So this is what a platform scorecard looks like. And then in each country, we also create league tables where people can compare the score across different platforms in that country. So these were our league tables in our pilot year from South Africa and India in 2019. And here, what you see is our league tables for 2020 that we've produced so far, which are South Africa and Germany. And over the rest of the year, we'll be producing reports for a few other countries as well. And now we've seen some of the best scoring platforms in some countries use our logo and the score that we give them on their own websites and apps. So you can see here an example from Flipkart in India that has used the 7 out of 10 Fairwork score on their website, and the same thing for No Sweat from last year. So what we basically see that this project can have potential impacts on different types of actors. First, with platforms directly, we envision both short and long-term impacts. In the short term, like I said, platforms have been quite willing to engage with us and display the Fairwork scores on their website. And we've had a few platforms agree to make concrete changes to the conditions that they offer workers in order to score better. And in the longer term, we hope that the pressure that we create will keep driving some of the change that we're looking to achieve and create more of a penalty for unfair work. As next steps, we'd like to do quite a few things with other actors that we interface with. So with workers, we want the Fairwork scores to serve as a benchmark for trade unions in much the same way as the Living Wage Foundation's calculations are now used as benchmarks that unions strive towards. Then also with regulators and policymakers, we want to try to use the Fairwork framework to inform policy development. We've been working with the ILO's, the International Labour Organization's Future of Work Commission, and labor lawyers and regulators in South Africa, India, and Germany to try and institutionally formalize the Fairwork principles in policy at different levels. And finally, with end users and consumers, beyond the signals that we send out that some companies do better than others, we're also trying to actively be in touch with large buyers like governments, universities, and consumer organizations, and to try and get them to endorse the Fairwork principles and work more with platforms that score well compared to platforms that don't score so well. And we're already seeing the project have impacts. After conversations with our team, a lot of platforms in South Africa, India, and Germany have committed to making some changes to their working conditions, like recognizing unions, instituting policies to make sure people don't earn below the minimum wage, instituting due process mechanisms and other policies like that. So to quickly summarize my part of the project, I just want to say that we do know that the digital revolution is undoubtedly is changing the landscape of work around the world. And we do really need to ensure that the jobs that are being created are good and decent jobs. And part of how we get there will be to use, our approach is to use research, not just to understand platforms and how they work, but use that research to make working conditions in the gig economy more visible in a reproducible and directly comparable manner. And our hope is that this project offers one way to hold platforms more accountable. Platforms do play a very key role in determining the quality of work that they offer. And we hope that our project can try to help them to acknowledge and live up to that responsibility. And before I hand over to Funda, I just wanted to tell you that we are hiring. And as you may have gathered from the list of countries that I mentioned, our project is expanding quite rapidly. And we've built quite a fantastic network of critical social justice-minded researchers in over 10 countries. And we're really excited to see what comes next. I personally really enjoy working at Fairwork and think it's an exciting time to be joining the project. So do consider applying yourself and help us share the opportunities widely, and all the details are on our website. And thanks to everyone who stayed with us so far. Please keep popping any questions in the chat. I see that there are already some questions. We'll get to them at the ending. And I will now hand over to Funda. I think you're muted.
Thanks. Thank you, Srujana, for the introduction to our project. I will go into specifics and mainly our ongoing COVID research. But before I start telling you about our research, we have a small poll for everyone who has joined us today in the webinar. So please go ahead and answer these questions. I'm just going to wait for 2 minutes and then we'll start. All right, I have some results already. So it seems to the first question, which was, how has your use of online platforms changed during the pandemic? There's a tie between those who said it has increased and those who said it didn't change. For the second question, how has your tipping changed during the pandemic? Majority of the participants today said it didn't change. And 33% said I started tipping the workers more. And for the final question, which platform in your opinion provided the best or most comprehensive protection to their workers during the pandemic? 10% said Deliveroo, 8% said Uber, 6% said Just Eat, and 85% said I don't know. So this is a good place to start our a discussion on the gig economy and COVID. If you can go to the next slide, please. So this project started in March, when we have noticed that more and more gig economy platforms started to roll out policies to protect both consumers and the workers. So we have done an online desk-based research, considering that we were also in lockdown in the UK, and we were not able to go out and interview workers. We started an online desk research with within our network, and we have surveyed 120 platforms across 23 countries across Europe, North America, South America, Asia, and Africa. We will post a link to our initial report, which was published in April 2020, but we have our next report coming up in August. And in this report, we will feature more than 200 platforms across 40 countries, and we will also update what has changed since April, considering that some countries went into further lockdowns or extended their lockdown periods, and some countries started to ease down their lockdowns. So we are going to explore what has changed during the pandemic and in its aftermath, if the aftermath is happening. We have categorized the platform responses that we have found according to the 5 Fairwork principles which Srujana just talked about. And we have used those principles and identified the basic specific categories of how platforms responded against decent work standards. So to give it a bit of detail, by fair pay in this research, we meant we looked into specific categories of pay loss compensation, financial deferral, if it was possible, if it was available on the platforms. And by financial deferral, we mean that for some platforms, workers need to have their own vehicles to be able to operate. So you can think of food delivery workers needing motorbikes, ride-hailing workers needing cars, and if they don't have access to their own cars, some platforms provide the opportunity for them to basically get loans from them to be able to pay to have their own vehicles. So for this principle, we looked at either if the platforms were offering any compensation for loss of pay during the period, either because workers were not able to go out and perform their tasks, which happened to some workers, especially if they were in industries that required close contact, such as beauty services, domestic cleaning, or care services. Or they compensated them for the loss of pay because less and less people were traveling, less and less people were able to order, things like that. For fair conditions, we divided actually this into 2 because of the range of policies that we have found, the range of measures that we have found platforms were offering. And these 2 were preventative measures and measures once and if the workers got ill. So for preventative measures, we looked at what kind of physical protection the platforms were offering, what kind of personal protection they were offering, such as access to PPE, personal hygiene, or any other resources. We looked at what kind of virus safety knowledge the platforms were offering to their workers, as well as healthcare assistance. And for the illness-related measures, we looked at sick pay, especially what kind of sick pay was available for workers, any kind of health insurance that was rolled out to workers, as well as death benefits. For fair contracts, we could not identify specific measures that the platforms rolled out, but we looked at whether the platforms were introducing any measures that were indirect sort of in the direction of them preventing any sort of changes to their contracts. And one example for this can be that some platforms required their workers to sign agreements that if they are seeking sick pay or any other benefits from the platforms, this will not change their terms and conditions with the platform. For fair management, we especially looked at penalty protection. If the workers, for instance, could not work during this period, would their ratings be affected? Would their any incentive structures change because of their lack of absence from the platforms, or their lack of their inability to fulfill their tasks as they used to? And for some platforms, discrimination became an issue. So we also looked at whether the platforms were publicly announcing anti-discrimination measures or policies. And discrimination can happen in many ways, but what we have noticed happening is some consumers or some users were actively not wanting to be delivered food from certain groups of people, or certain groups of people being excluded for the general bias in the populations where they live, that they are particularly affected by the virus. So we also looked for measures where the platforms were taking a stance against these kind of potential discrimination possibilities. So if we can go to the other slide. So this is our, this is an updated table that will become forthcoming in our next report. So if you look at our current COVID report, it will look slightly different than this. So please, you know, this is the main reason why they're different. So this will be in our forthcoming report, as we have updated how the platforms have been responding since April. Some of the changes I can mention is that it became very, very common for all platforms really to provide contact-free services, and that's part of the physical protection measures that platforms have taken. And personal protection was also very common, that the platforms rolled out to provide hand sanitizers, masks, or personal protective equipment otherwise. And more platforms also started offering virus safety knowledge about how the virus spreads and how the workers can protect themselves. We have also seen an increasing number of platforms providing sick pay and some level of protection against penalties if the workers are unable to work during for extended periods of time during the platforms. But as you can see, in terms of fair pay, we are still lacking significant number of platforms rolling out any policies for pay loss compensation. And what we mean by pay loss compensation is basically offering a minimum level of wage or subsistence level to workers if they're unable to work during this time, or either because they themselves are ill, or they need to protect themselves because they are included in the vulnerable population group by the government, set by the government, or a member of their family is ill, or they need to protect their family members. And perhaps it's very important to mention here also that because of their contractual status, which Srujana also explained, most platform workers were unable to benefit from government benefit schemes, including in the UK, because they are either not considered as workers by the platforms, or they do not necessarily fulfill the criteria set for self-employed people. And that means that they were at a particular disadvantage in terms of pay loss and in terms of how they can survive this period. So if you look at our report, the previous one, which is available on our website, you will see that we have done this table, this scorecard for 23 different countries and 120 platforms. And in the new report, we will have about 200. A couple of things, perhaps disclaimers about this scorecard is that if you look at these scorecards, you will see that big platforms have been able to roll out significantly more policies than smaller platforms. And this perhaps requires a bit of our attention. So for instance, across the different countries we have looked at, Uber has been very proactive in offering certain measures, same with Amazon. But in terms of their financial capability, they are, for instance, significantly different than local platforms that we have observed in countries like India, South Africa, Indonesia, or in other places. So when we are evaluating platforms in terms of how they responded, it is also important to keep in mind their own financial situation. And what we have seen during this research is that platforms have also been affected quite significantly because of the pandemic and how the pandemic changed their revenue structures. This is, of course, not a legitimization in any way of not doing anything about platforms, but it's an indication of what they can do, realistically what they can provide. And this also brings me to another question about how the governments can respond to this and check if the platforms are compiling with the measures they're saying that they have provided as well. So our scorecard is composed of our research online, but where possible, we have also interviewed workers in India and South Africa, for instance, through our existing relations. And this entailed that we have been able to identify, for instance, even when platforms said that they're offering certain policies, whether they were actually offering them. So what we have seen with physical protection and personal protection, and especially, for instance, contact-free delivery or PPE, which have become sort of buzzwords in this pandemic, is that a majority of platforms said they were providing these, but when we asked the workers whether they had access to them, they said it was very difficult to get that access, and if the platform said they would be reimbursed, and the process was set up in such a cumbersome way that they were not able to access them. We have found similar things which related to sick pay as well. Either the sick pay was significantly lower than their earnings, so even if they accessed the sick pay provided by the platforms, this would not be sufficient for them to survive on, or the process was set up in such a cumbersome way that they were not able to access it at all. So these are some of the sort of caveats that we have to keep in mind when we're looking into this table. If we can continue with the next slide. In terms of our findings, so our main finding was that what workers want and need was to maintain and is to maintain their income, but platforms largely left this to governments. But with the government schemes being rolled out to either employees, like the furlough scheme in the UK, or the self-employed people, self-employed. For the self-employed, there were significant requirements, meant that platform workers ended up falling through the cracks. And this creates both a financial vulnerability for the workers, but it's also a healthcare vulnerability as well, because this means that even when they're sick, even at the cost of making their family members sick, workers had to continue working during the pandemic. Most platforms, as I mentioned, offered preventative measures, but the access to these measures still remain an issue. And perhaps I should mention that to be able to respond to the operational pressures during the pandemic, as I mentioned, some platforms could not operate at all. They have found a solution to expand their services. So we have seen platforms, for instance, normally doing B2 services, sort of rolling out delivery services or offering healthcare services, or existing delivery platforms expanding into food delivery, supermarket delivery, sort of expanding the scope of the services they provide on their platforms. But we do not have enough evidence, for instance, now, whether this expanded services also benefited the workers themselves, because as they were expanding these services, the range of services the platforms were offering on their platforms, they also increased the number of workers. So we do not know, and it's perhaps it remains to be seen whether workers managed to benefit from this as well. If we can go to the next slide. So we have set up, so we have in our report, you can also find, we have provided some policy recommendations for the platforms specifically, but also the governments as well. And perhaps the most important one, the key one, is fair pay. A rapid access to minimum income, which the workers can continue their lives with, so that they do not feel pressure to work if they feel ill, if they feel sick. And in terms of fair conditions, regular, adequate, and free. And I would like to definitely emphasize this free part of PPE for the workers, so that they do not need to consider this as an extra cost that they need to take on if they would like to work during this time. And another thing to stress is definitely accessible sick pay. So platforms that we have reviewed have very, very different sick pay policies, some offering only a week long, some offering 14 days, some offering a couple of days, some offering really generous schemes, including the family members of the workers. But there's just not one standard, and usually what is offered is very hard to access and not enough for the workers to be able to survive this period. And for fair contracts, we are suggesting that there should not be any temporary or permanent alteration of contracts during the period of the pandemic that will be detrimental to the workers. And in terms of fair management, to be able to deal with the needs of the workers during this time, to sort out their needs for sick pay or getting access to PPE, a fair management system that includes not only sort of algorithmic management, but actual human management is necessary. And for fair representation, we have seen cases where platforms actively discouraged or punished workers for engaging in collective action during this time against the conditions they were experiencing. So we recommend formal receipt of engagement with an action on COVID-19 related demands from worker representatives, and this includes definitely the unions which have been very active in this period. And this concludes my slides, but if you have any questions related to our report or our upcoming report, please feel free to ask in the Q&A, and we'll answer them. Thank you.
So there's quite a lot of questions. Maybe we can just get started at the top and work our way down.
That sounds good.
The first question is from Magdalena Sofia. Have you got any impact measures on how workers' well-being changes once their platform endorses the Fairwork principles? Okay, so I guess our project is a year-on-year project where we do go back and interview workers at the same platforms every year, and we, in this sense, develop a longitudinal database that allows us to see if what workers are reporting about their working conditions changes. So far, though, our project has been active only for 2 years, and so our data on this is limited. At the same time, I guess we are tracking and making public any commitments that platforms have made and publicizing them as widely as possible so that workers and unions hopefully are aware of them and then can use them in their own discussions and negotiations with platforms. Funda, do you have anything to add on that?
Yes, I mean, this is very difficult to, it's very difficult to give a quantitative sort of answer to questions like these. But perhaps we can mention that depending on the number of people working for the platforms, any changes, any positive changes they make affects those workers that work for those platforms, essentially. One example I can give is Urban Club in India, for instance, has committed to change, translate their contracts into local languages. But given that we're talking about the context of a huge population and also a big workforce, this means that also a great number of workers have been affected with this positively, which means that they will be able to now understand what they're signing up to when they're signing work contracts, and they have more leverage with the platforms to be able to say no to specific conditions if they do not agree with them.
That's great. The second question is from Saloni. She asks, there has been an emergence of platform co-ops as a response to the traditional gig economy. Does the Fairwork Foundation do any work with platform co-ops? So we have tried to account for a variety of platform operational models in the way that our principles are designed. So platform co-ops would be the few types of platforms that would score probably the 2 points under principle 5. Very few platforms are able to score fair representation points easily because it sets quite a high bar. Platform co-ops, by enabling more democratic processes of worker decision making, do tend to score more. So far, we have not engaged with any platform co-ops because they tend not to be among the largest platforms in different contexts, because I'm not entirely sure why platform co-ops don't compete that well, but so far we haven't. But if and when we do, I think that our principles would allow them to score higher and therefore reflect better compared to other more commercial platforms. The second question that Saloni has, wait, sorry, Funda, do you want to add anything on that before I?
No, that was good. Thank you.
The second question from Saloni is, are there any gender-specific indicators while assessing platforms? So the top line 10 thresholds do not have gender-specific indicators, but when you drill down to fair conditions and fair management, there we look at the conditions that different types of workers face, including women. So women do have different needs that we expect platforms to be able to cater to, and to be able to, in the fair management principle, we ask several questions about how they are ensuring the safety and how they are managing different groups of workers, including women. But at the top level of the 10 thresholds, I guess we do not draw gender out as a specific category. But also we are conducting some more targeted research into gender, and we're hoping to publish a paper on gender drawing from our data over the next year or so. So hopefully that's something that we will be able to expand upon in the future.
I can perhaps add here that gender definitely constitutes a major theme in our work, and something we really deeply care about. And for instance, with COVID work, this was also one of the main research themes that we explored. It's because during the pandemic, we have noticed that the platforms that stopped operating were mainly the platforms where women workers tended to be the majority of workers, such as beauty services, personal care services, domestic work. And this meant that pay loss affected women workers significantly. And also women during the pandemic tend to be more burdened, if I may say, with family care and care responsibilities. And this also affected their abilities to whether or not they can continue their work during the pandemic. So we definitely have a gender lens in our research, even though this might not be necessarily reflected in the overall principles.
Great. I think that also answers Shweta's question, which is the next question. Yeah. Joanna's question says, hi there, thank you. You're welcome. Specifically geographically specific work, for example, transport or deliveries, own account employment has existed in developing countries for a long time, and it's only, it's only recently that platforms come into the market as intermediaries through apps, and they do impose some form of control over how the work is being delivered. So first question, what is the role of government in ensuring that these principles are upheld? And the second question is, how do you account for platform workers who switch between platforms or pursue several types of work within the informal sector? So with regards to the first question about the role of government, so far in a lot of different contexts, the law has been slow to catch up, and the whole debate over classification is where platforms have been able to take advantage of labor law that does not entirely is not entirely sort of made with platform work in mind, and that's kind of why a lot of these issues occur in the first place. There are countries where policymakers are trying to address this issue and trying to come up with innovative ways of finding new employment classifications to classify platform workers and allow them to access some of the benefits that traditional employees do, but so far it's not as advanced as we'd like it to be. So we are hoping that the Fairwork framework can inform policy, and we're trying to advocate for this where possible, wherever we have opportunities. The role of government, I guess, I don't know, Funda, do you have anything to add about the role of government?
Yeah, this especially with the within the context of more largely informal economies, the positionality of the government becomes very interesting, especially because we are also seeing, especially in the global south context, already informal work practices being turned into platformized work. So for instance, domestic work has been largely an informal work practice across the world, and now through the platforms there is a I do not want to use the word formalizing, just because there is now data about it. It's more about how the working relationships are changing. But in terms of the government's response and how the platforms are responding, we really need to have a discussion about what is being formalized and how is this work relationship changing, and how did the governments that did not necessarily consider a work arrangement that was formal or informal before, how are they responding to this newly forming working relationship? There is, of course, sort of a discussion there about the capacities of particular governments as well. For some governments, it is easier, perhaps because of their financial fiscal capacities, to be able to implement regulation or consider sort of enforcing more rigid employment rules. But for others, there are also those kind of limitations.
Thank you. Yeah, that all makes sense. I have misplaced the question, but there was a second part about workers who switch between different platforms. So that is, I think, one of the reasons why it is a little bit more complicated to ask platforms to provide the same sorts of rights that companies do, because they say, well, workers are able to switch between different platforms. They're not entirely using their time engaged working with us. So why should we be compensating them for work, for example, when they're waiting, when food delivery workers are waiting outside restaurants? They could be waiting for orders on multiple apps. So why should we be compensating them? So the definitions of what is considered working time, what is considered work-related costs, these are all things that platforms find ways to sort of creatively define in order to evade responsibilities. And part of that is that, yes, the additional flexibility that workers have to choose between different platforms makes it a bit difficult to locate responsibility on platforms. However, there are different definitions, and our definition of work-related costs and active hours and things like that, you can look it up on our website, but they basically try and find ways to identify where and how platforms can be responsible despite this additional flexibility that workers do have. And there are ways to do that. There are ways to methodologically identify and locate responsibility on platforms. So that's kind of what we're trying to do, is provide a different debate, angle into this debate that's going on worldwide. Okay, the next question is, are you seeing evidence of consumers gravitating towards the more ethical platforms? It's hard to say because we don't research with consumers directly. However, the more, I guess, a large part of our work is about public relations and trying to like make our scores visible as possible and trying to use these scores, publish them through like using consumer pressure and media pressure to try and enact the changes that we hope to see. So I think the louder we shout, the more we will see that. And there's been some good indications because of great media coverage that we've had, but as far as individual consumers making different choices, well, I hope that they are, but I personally do not know. Funda?
I just have been notified that the next question will be our last. So if it's okay, I would like to take one question regarding our job posts. And I see here Rui Ramos has just posted a question saying that the job post states the usage of participant observation. Can you expand on this? What type of observations were, participant with whom, amount of time on field, etc. So this is a really interesting question, and comes it asks about our methodology as well. So if it's okay, Srujana, I will answer this one. All right. So yes, participant observation is definitely a key methodology that we use in our research, and this involves us going to the field, and this means observing where the delivery workers gather, how they, for instance, wait for orders, what do they do between different orders, also observing ride-hailing platforms, the drivers during their rides, how do they work, how do they respond to different queries, and also how do they manage their relationship with the platforms, either through the app or through worker hubs or any kind of management centers. The amount of time we spend in the field really depends on the particular context and the particular research question we have for that context. And what I mean by this is that we find it somewhat easier to access some workers than others. And what I mean by this is that some workers are more visible than others. You might also think that, you probably also see delivery riders constantly at this at this point, but it is really tricky to be able to see or identify who is a domestic worker and who is working on which platform. So we have various strategies for reaching out to workers, and our research includes spending extended periods of time in the field, basically discussing the issues workers have on that they experience on the platforms, either during their work hours, if we can be there, or outside of their work hours by chatting to them. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think I'm good. I think that we've run out of time, but there's a lot of really excellent questions in here that we will try and write up answers to and share in the follow-up email that OII will be sending around to everybody.
Or we can answer these questions also. If you have any questions for us, we're happy to answer them via Twitter as well. Our accounts are, if we can just write it on the screen perhaps, or in the chat.
Fairwork is at the bottom of the slide. That's our Twitter. Our website is www.fair.work. And you can always reach out to us, info@fair.work, or all of our emails are also on the website. So just reach out to us individually as well. We'll try and get some answers together for these excellent questions. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much.
For staying with us until the end. Hopefully.
Thank you both so much. No, that was excellent. Just to say that we will include in the follow-up email all of those details you listed. We'll put links to your website, we'll put all of your Twitter handles, everything will be in there. And you've referenced today as well, so that it's all in one nice tidy email for everyone. So thank you both so much. We really appreciate you giving our time, and thank you very much to our audience for attending. As you said, the follow-up email will come in the next day or so, depending on how long it takes us to get everything together. And the recording of the talk will also be available on our website. So thank you so much to everyone, and we wish you all a really wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.